Hello, everyone. Welcome to Latter-day Struggles. This is your host, Valerie. Happy to have you here with me again today. Taylor Petrey, how are you?
Great. Good to be back.
Yes, we are going to jump right into a second part of this two-part conversation where we are talking about the proclamation to the family, some recent buzz about it, the discussion that was had, there's a talk in General Conference that many of you may have listened to, and also I think it's been sort of hotter than it used to be because of the call of Dallin Oaks to be the prophet and president of the church. And around that period of time, Taylor wrote a couple of one opinion piece and then a follow-up. So Taylor, give us a bit of an overview of what we talked about last week as we jump deeper into this topic.
Sure. So I decided that for the 30th anniversary, I wanted to write a little piece reflecting on the question of the genre of the proclamation on the family. What kind of a document is a proclamation? Where does it situate itself in the history of LDS doctrines and different kinds of authoritative statements and so on, to try to give some sense to that. There was some pushback about that. And I then decided to write a little follow-up piece to that as well, just on social media, on Facebook and Twitter, to kind of give some further commentary on the commentary.
Gotcha. Yes. And we started talking a little bit about the differences and the loaded nature of these words, revelation, doctrine, commentary, proclamation, and how what we're doing here in this moment in and around the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is we're trying to make sense of or make meaning of these words in the context of authority, and how much authority do certain words carry, how much authority, if you move something from a proclamation or a doctrine or revelation to commentary, what does that mean? What does that bring up in people? And so today's episode is going to be a deeper dive into that. And as preparation for that, one of the things I did is I started thinking to myself, okay, being a lifelong member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, if I hear the word doctrine, what are some immediate words that kind of come up for me? And I'm going to just roll through this list. This is not, a declarative list. This is just a list that I did make, not that I would have made, but I did make it. So I would assume it was prophetic, unchanging, everlasting, from God, not culturally or politically motivated, informed, or connected, not negotiable. And that if I disagreed, this would be evidence of my lack of faith and my rebellion, not necessarily just from the church, but from actual God. And that I'm expected to accept this without question as a sign of my faith in God and my loyalty to the church. Okay, so that loads the word doctrine up with a lot of things. Now, whether that is commonly believed by every one of you out there listening, I don't know. But if it were, then that really does mean that if anything is stated as doctrine, the statement connected to doctrine doesn't have a lot of wiggle room there. And then one runs into trouble if and when something changes, because things do change. So let's jump into what say you about this, Taylor? Just what comes up for you as you hear me sort of talking about my understanding of what I used to think, or maybe still think that that's what a lot of people think doctrine is, connected to the LDS Church.
Yeah, I think that's a great reaction to a common way that many Latter-day Saints would understand that term. And the question of what is doctrine and how do we identify it then becomes a really important question, right? I would the only other thing that I would maybe add to it is for many people, doctrine is salvational, right? To understand and to know the doctrines is then connected to your salvation, right? And so it takes on a lot of importance, not just for the governing of the church, right? But I think for our own well-being, right? And there's a sense that then if you also know it, then your behavior, your actions will then conform to it as well, right? So an understanding of what doctrine is, I think does have a very high level of authority in the church.
Yes. And I think in some ways, and maybe this is where, again, it gets a little slippery because it seems like it always does. Oftentimes, doctrine is in some way, shape, or form connected to revelation. In other words, a lot of times doctrine comes through revelation, and that's what kind of gives it its sort of divine mandate or its importance, and it's connected to our obedience to that doctrine because it's via revelation, and by living the doctrine, we receive salvation or something like that. So I mean, there's a chain of events that fall that become like really important. I mean, we're talking existentially important, connected to this concept of doctrine and revelation. And I think that's one of the reasons why your work connected to the proclamation seems to be important right now, because of two things that I want us to sort of play with for the rest of this time together today, Taylor. I'm going to just read a handful of words that were specifically said in Elder Rasband's October 2025 talk, the Family Proclamation, Words from God. And then I want to spend some time talking about, if on the one hand, the words that I'm going to read that are I'm taking straight from his talk, and then we're going to spend some time talking about the proclamation itself as, in some ways, really complicating what he's saying by nature of actual history, and how the proclamation itself is, in fact, very much trying to negotiate very complex and changing understandings of gender and sexuality, both culturally at large, but also within the church itself. And so it's not just an external conversation and negotiation. It's a negotiation with the church and its teachings and its other doctrines itself. Okay, so here we go. So Elder Rasband, in this talk titled The Family Proclamation, Words from God, uses the following words when he's talking about the proclamation itself. Revelatory words. He says they have divine origin. He says we must treat it with the reverence deserving words of God. He also says it's a decisive declaration. Another phrase is, we had members of the Quorum of the 12 that were receiving revelation. Another quote straight from the talk, whether mine own voice or by the voice of my servants, it is the same. And then another little phrase, the proclamation on the family is, as President Hinckley stated, doctrine. Two more. The next one is, the teachings were revealed by our Lord Jesus Christ and his apostles then and now. And then finally, our Father in heaven has provided the proclamation on the family to help guide us home to him. And then I guess I lied. There's one more. This is a whole quote, so it's different than my bullet points. Okay, so this is just a quote from the same talk. President Hinckley stated, we have felt to warn and forewarn of standards, doctrines, and practices relative to the family, which prophets, seers, and revelators of this church have repeatedly stated throughout its history. Okay, so let's talk about the complications connected to the weight that all of those statements make about doctrine, revelation, enduring, never changing in the face of the proclamation itself. Okay, so before we move too quickly, I want to give you space to comment if you have anything to say before we go deeper into this.
Yeah, no, it's evident that church leaders for a long time, and especially Elder Rasband, assign the highest or near highest level of authority to the proclamation, short of it being canonized. And there is a movement from some on the far right to challenge church leaders to canonize it, right? But yeah, he seems to put it in that highest level of category there. And even the way that I think that he talks about his prophetic calling, or his apostolic calling rather, as being charged in that moment with defending, preserving, and promoting the proclamation as one of his primary duties, right, is an interesting way to understand how they're being sort of trained as apostles, what they see their responsibilities are, what the message is that they should be focusing on, right? And so I take him at his word that he was sort of instructed that the proclamation is really central to his apostolic mission as well, and that he takes that seriously. So it seems to be that they assign it an incredibly high level of authority.
And I think this is a really, really important conversation to be having and to be thinking about, because what the proclamation is really sort of emphasizing is the cultural shift around issues of gender, sexuality, marriage, family, power dynamics, patriarchy, equality issues. And so to privilege this as the most important thing for the leadership of the church to sort of maintain this sort of traditional stance around all of these things is in fact a really, not only is it in some ways I think kind of sad and heartbreaking, because I think this is where all the healing could happen, is if we would really look into those exact questions. But where I would prefer for us to focus today, Taylor, is I would love for you to give us a little bit of an education around how, on the one hand, this document seems to be something that is really important for the current leadership to be really like leaning into and focusing and emphasizing, and yet at the same time, the very stances that the proclamation is setting in stone have changed over and over again. So will you please, if you like, walk us through, and I know there are many, many of these topics, walk us through just a handful of ways in which internal to the LDS Church, we have changed our stance doctrinally on issues of gender, on issues of marriage, on issues of sexuality. So just take it away, because, and I know there's a grab bag of so many choices. So choose your favorite.
We'd have to go for another full hour if I got to everything, but a few highlights that I think are helpful and instructive, because this is not the first time that church leaders have taught that what they're currently teaching is the unchanging doctrine of the church. Okay, issues about race and sexuality, I think, are really, really important ones for understanding this. It is a myth that church leaders never taught that the curse of Ham, the priesthood and temple prohibitions on Black members of the church were not doctrine. They repeatedly taught that it was an unchanging doctrine until it wasn't anymore. And interrelated to that, and one of the things that I try to really point out, is that this was not just about race, it was about sexuality. It was about who you could marry. And one of their biggest concerns for getting rid of the priesthood and temple ban was that it would lead to interracial marriage. And so if you asked a church leader in 1970, what is one of the most pressing social issues of the day, they would have said interracial marriage. They were really freaked out about that. And it had implications for them, because they understood that descendants of interracially married couples would not be eligible to be full participants in the church, right? And so they worried that there was going to be a situation where all of Brazil or all of the United States was going to be interracially married, and therefore no one would be eligible to run the church. And so that was a very huge, pressing doctrinal concern for them. Around the same time, we also have big controversies going on about birth control. And church leaders understood, quote, the commandment to multiply and replenish as being a prohibition on birth control. And it was very reluctantly that the church changes that stance in the 1980s. But we even see that language seeping back into the proclamation, where it is a commandment to multiply and replenish the earth. If you asked a church leader in the 1960s, early 1970s, what it means to say that this is a commandment to multiply and replenish, they would have said, well, that means birth control is prohibited. But if you ask a church leader today, almost none would say that the implications of that statement mean that, right? So even we can adopt the exact same language there and say, there are completely different interpretations of what we think that means, or what the implications of that might mean. And so that's going back not even that long. That's in with your and I lifetime here, right? But we can go, of course, back to plural marriage and the way that church leaders taught this as an unchanging doctrine that we cannot ever compromise on, until they did, right? And now almost no church leaders would ever want to go back to that in any way, and are, it's an embarrassing and complicated part of our history. And this is, again, any historian is going to tell you that, today's doctrines are going to change. What church leaders think is the most important issue 50 years from now is going to look very different from what it does now, just because what the church thinks is very important now looks very different from what it said 50 years ago. They were publishing articles that women wearing pants would lead to lesbianism. And, this was the stuff that they were teaching, right? And so their perspectives change over time, and I think that we can continue to expect them. Does that mean that they should? Is a separate question, right? But I'm making a historical point here that doctrines evolve and change and have evolved and changed on these very topics. Whether or not they should is a separate one, but whether or not they can is the question that I want to really help us to think through.
What comes up for me as I'm listening, Taylor, is how incredibly inconvenient historians and scholars sometimes are, right? Because I think about a lot of what churches, and this is not just the LDS church, but this is kind of my understanding is when this this isn't even church specific, but like if you think about the narrative of a family or a country, that one's history is about the creation of identity and even perhaps the creation of an arc that looks like a hero's journey or something like that. And that if one can convince their country or their church to sort of see history not as what happened, but as what feels cohesive to us to create deeper community, then you're talking about something that might be meaningful for some people. It's just not history anymore. Right. And I think that's a whole piece of this conversation, which to you, in your commentary, in your books, and in this recent opinion piece, is you're basically kind of just saying that we can say that doctrine is unchanging, but history is before us, and doctrine can change and does change, and that isn't necessarily problematic. What becomes problematic is the denial of reality that it's changing, and the expectation or the hope that everybody will sort of collude in this delusion. And I feel like that's probably a strong way to say it, but it feels frustrating. And I think what you're trying to do in a very generous way is just you're wanting to help the church square itself up with the reality of actual history. And so you do this in, I thought, a very interesting and compelling way in your follow-up conversation on Facebook, which probably a lot of my listeners, maybe I think probably a fair amount of them watch you on social media, but just in case some of them don't, spend a little bit of time talking about how you lean into the possibility that maybe we can just look at different ways or different interpretations of the word doctrine itself in a way that makes space for these inevitable changes that happen. So speak into that if you would.
Yeah, I really try to delve into, the three contested terms, that the categories that we had been talking about: commentary, doctrine, and revelation. And I wanted to sort of acknowledge that there was, in the very brief opinion piece that I gave, that there was a wider set of definitions that people might offer these terms, and to acknowledge that there were some maybe disagreements with that one could have with me on the meanings of these terms and how we think about them. But a lot of what it comes down to, I think, for me, is recognizing the historical and interpretive practices that are involved in making doctrine. And again, we've mentioned that makes some people uncomfortable, sort of thinking about the human element, thinking about the historical as a factor here, right? But it's hard to come to any other conclusion when you actually look at the history of the church, when you actually consider. And again, I don't say that just as a historian of Mormonism. I'm a historian of Christianity. I start from the very beginning. We haven't even gotten started on the differences between contemporary Mormonism and the biblical world, which are radically different in how they understand gender, sexuality, family, and so on. So really getting us to think about this is something not just churches do. We all have this problem. We can't recognize our own historical situatedness. We can't always see clearly how the views that we have or the actions that we take belong to and participate in a larger thing. You and I grew up in the 90s, where the use of certain like slurs was incredibly common, and now I'm mortified by the fact that those were kind of the casual perspectives that we all had. Even if we didn't have those prejudices, we still like casually participated in a culture that did that. Yeah, so I think it's always hard for us in the moment to kind of see ourselves, and that's especially I think true for churches. And it is scary. I acknowledge it is scary to say maybe we should think about this again, right? Maybe there are more ways of thinking about it, or maybe there's a new set of problems that have emerged because of the choices that we've made up until this point that are worth reconsidering now too. I'll give just one other example, and I know we don't have a ton of time, but just was one more that came to me while you were talking. You know, in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and even up into the 1990s and early 2000s, as the church is producing the family proclamation, they consistently taught and strongly believed that there was a cure for homosexuality, for if not many, if not all, then many Latter-day Saints could be cured from homosexuality. They promoted Evergreen International, which is a reparative therapy movement in church buildings around the country. They trained church leaders in how to sort of heal people from homosexuality. And they strongly believe this. And so when the proclamation comes out and the opposition to same-sex marriage and homosexuality comes out, it was in a worldview that they accepted where homosexuality could cease to exist if we properly taught it out of people, right? And they eventually abandoned that position by the early 2010s and now, support anti-conversion therapy laws in Utah for minors and so on. And we really see the church has shifted on this issue. But it is now the proclamation exists in a world in which a significant number of Latter-day Saints are uncurably queer. Right, that the church acknowledges and accepts that fact, right? But the proclamation doesn't imagine a world in which that is possible, right? And so I think a lot of what the contemporary moment is also reconciling where the church is at even on issues of homosexuality relative to where they were 30 years ago is a completely different position. And that's a space where there then needs to be some greater conversation.
Right. And I think what I'm feeling as I'm listening to you is how wonderful that at least even if it's not being explicitly spoken of, we aren't doing conversion therapy anymore. In other words, we want progress to be made, and we want churches in general, our church in particular, to be cognizant of updates and further light and knowledge in the realm of, well, everything, quite frankly. But for our conversation around issues of gender and sexuality and LGBTQ issues, and yet at the same time, what this does is this causes this tension that remains very present but just unspoken. And in some ways, it's almost like change is made, or at very least, there's an evolution of understanding, but there's almost like I see it as a bit of a strange contradiction that if something is happening and we don't talk about it, we sort of have to hold the tension of both at the same time, because they are acknowledging a variety of updates, of cultural changes around issues of gender and sexuality. Some of our doctrine and policies are even changing around these issues. And yet at the same time, we then, even in 2025, are using words that are decisive, of divine origin, revelatory, unchanging. It's incredibly discombobulating and contradictory, because these are two very, very opposite notions that are, I'm experiencing them as being expected to be holding both, even though they're categorically, you can't hold both at the same time and feel any sort of internal consistency. Am I making any sense, Taylor?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Right?
Yeah.
Is that again that tension between these notions of fixity and eternal doctrines and unchangingness, right? And our own experiences, our own history, our own knowledge of what's actually happened, right? To see those changes. Now, that's not to say that there aren't consistencies, that we can't draw
Sure.
lines of consistency through there, but those are consistencies that are made through interpretations, right? That we kind of make a claim that there is a consistency, just as we're making a claim that there are inconsistencies. Those are interpretive acts, not self-evident.
Well, and I think what I'm appreciating as you and I are talking is that I don't have a problem at all with having a stance, and this can be just a personal thing, I can have a stance over here and maybe even feel very, very strongly about it. And then I can realize something or experience something that awakens me to greater light and truth. And then I can change my position. I think the problem one would run into if they were hanging out with me would be if I change my position, but continue to make the claim that I never have to change my position and my positions are always right, while they notice that I'm actually changing my positions all the time, even though some of my positions are even better than they used to be, right? And so, so let's do this. I really want to spend a little bit of time talking about this with you. I'm interested in how much is this tension that we're experiencing connected to the fact that we are an authoritarian church? Because, and let me play that a little bit with you and then have you comment. In my study of this topic at large and your couple of opinion pieces, it kind of occurred to me that I was like, wait a second. Now, if this wasn't an authoritarian church, would we be running into some of these same problems? And so in my study, I thought to myself, okay, what are some of the sort of the implicit or maybe explicit expectations of institutions of this nature? And again, this is just my process. So I'm not declaratively saying this is thus saith Valerie. I'm not saying that. So I'm just thinking about how I process this. Okay, so my thoughts around the expectation of Mormonism, which is, it's an authoritarian institution, is there's an expectation that something is so because the authority figure says it's so. Also, that there's sort of a little bit of an implicit expectation that history is sort of a tool used for faith promotion, that it's to create a sort of a cohesive narrative and a shared identity, and that history ought not to be used for any other reason. And if it is, sometimes there's like the accusation of like lack of faith, or, that you've gotten your hands on the wrong kind of information, right? Something else I was thinking about is the expectation is that you trust your authority figures and that you don't need to investigate or make claims about things such as church history that aren't endorsed by the church. A couple others I was thinking about is the expectation that doctrine is not commentary. It's not multi-directional. It's not about meaning making as we're negotiating reality. And the last one I was thinking about is in an authoritarian institution, in general, the expectation is that doctrine lives outside of culture and politics. And if it's involved at all, it's shaping culture. It's never being shaped by culture. So, okay, those are just my thoughts, but let me circle back and re-ask my question, Taylor. To what degree are we struggling with this particular problem because this institution is sort of formally set up as authoritarian in nature? And that's what makes this messy and complicated.
Yeah. I think that's a great question, and I don't know if I have a definitive quick answer to it. I will note that every religious institution is dealing with this issue, and every religious institution is having a crisis on this issue. In fact, we're maybe dealing with it slightly better than many others, which are splitting. You've got the Methodists, the Episcopalians, the Reformed churches. All of these churches are splitting up. They are dividing over this issue. And, I think that many Latter-day Saints would look at those and feel sorry that, like, wouldn't it be nicer if you just had an authoritarian structure here to say what it is, what's true, what's not, right? And in many ways, Mormonism is really born out of this very crisis of religious authority, right? Joseph Smith says all these different churches are teaching all these different things. How am I supposed to know, right? And he comes up with a solution to that through prophetic authority as the answer to it. And so in a way, it's for many Latter-day Saints, it may be considered the asset that the church has relative to other groups who are struggling with this, right? And it is also a liability in other ways as well, because we have to recognize the contingency of those particular groups who happen to be running the church, who happen to be, what questions are they asking? What sorts of life experiences have they had, right? How we all know that our own individual experiences are shape the way that we receive divine experiences as well, right? And so we might think of them as limited in that way. Now, maybe they've got it exactly right, right? I don't. I'm. It's not my job to make that decision, right? But definitely that question of how decisions come to be made, who gets to make them, how different church leaders are taking those into consideration is something that our church faces, but it's also one that I don't think makes us necessarily unique. And in some respects, there are worse ways of dealing with it out there too. So yeah, the unfortunate thing for me, I think, is that there is not always enough space for a broader set of perspectives in the church. And so one of the effects I think that we see is people decide that there's no room for them in this church anymore, right? The way that the church understands things, the way that church leaders understand things has shut them out of full participation in the church. And I do think that it's worth really thinking about that problem potentially. Yeah.
One little follow-up I have to what you're saying about kind of the scope of this issue. In your response to my question about how connected is this to like the authoritarian nature of the church, and I guess what I'm most interested in is, to what degree is authoritarianism connected to one specific point that I want to make?
Mm-hmm.
And it's as follows. When they say doctrine is thus because it's always been that way, and someone in the constituency with no power says, but it hasn't always been that way. So doctrine can be what the church chooses it to be, but it you can't continue to say it is this way because it's always been this way, because it clearly hasn't always been this way. And that's when the authoritarianism kicks in, which basically kind of just shuts the thing down and says, I choose by authoritarian fiat as opposed to facing reality.
Right.
That's where I see the problem, or I guess said differently, that's where I see authoritarianism coming in, which is I don't want to address historical reality in that doctrine has changed. I choose to say it hasn't changed. I smack the word revelation or doctrine or eternal or thus saith the Lord on top of it. And we all have to collude in believing that which is simply not real.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, this is, a long the long-standing tension between church leaders and historians, right? Is is definitely what you're speaking to, and I think there's a lot to this, where we're all perfectly happy in saying that church leaders have the full authority to define what church doctrine is, right? But they don't get to define history, right? That's the realm of historians, right? Now, there's a lot of bad history out there too,
Sure.
right? And history is it's similarly not a revealed process. It's one that takes a lot of work to sort of discern and understand and make sense of and weigh competing perspectives on, right? But yes, I think that you're right to raise the kind of worries about a rewriting of history that we sometimes see in the emphasis of doctrines, and especially in including doctrines on this point, and it does strike me often as a kind of casual observer of online conversations about this, how unaware many Latter-day Saints are of the changes on these topics, again, including in our own lifetimes, right? And that we just seem to like not notice those somehow, or that we ignore those as if they're inconsequential. But I think they're highly consequential, and they're worth thinking through.
I couldn't agree more, especially when it comes to, I think, some of our greatest shadow parts in Mormonism: power, gender, sexuality. These are the places where if we would address these issues, I think we would find a great deal of healing. And I just feel so deeply about that. Okay, we only have a few minutes left. So I have a question I want you to address in closing, Taylor. In your follow-up commentary, you actually offered a really beautiful solution to this messy problem. You offered the idea that there are a few well-established ways to think about doctrine, and one of them makes space for historical evolution of ideas. So would you just very quickly, and I know we're not giving enough time, we're not giving this the time it deserves, but offer to our audience, if you would, how did you how did you provide a way for the proclamation on the family to continue to be doctrine, but also to be evolving?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay. I'll try to do this efficiently, as you said. So, one definition of doctrine that has become very popular is one that's published by the church itself, right? Is that there is a consistency over time, right? And there's a kind of implicitness of that claim that that it's possible to be inconsistent over time, right? Or that it takes a long time for a doctrine to be established because it takes time, or right? History is sort of built into the concept of doctrine there. And I wanted to kind of like explore that piece a little bit and say that in part helping to think about history as a contingent factor of doctrine helps us to understand the past better, understand the present better, and especially in relationship to the past, and also opens us up to future possibilities that might not be immediately apparent in the status quo either, right? And so to understand that doctrine is historically and contingently produced, I think is very much at the heart of what Latter-day Saints understand and define as continuing revelation, right? The idea that change is an inevitable feature here is not to deny that that the past has not been guided by revelation. It's not to deny that a doctrine is authoritative, but rather that we can always be open to new possibilities as new questions arise. And so thinking about like the historical production, the historical developments of doctrine, I think is a really important piece for helping us to actually give them the proper authority as well.
Yes. So let me see if I can summarize as a layperson. You define two different ways of thinking about doctrine, one which is sort of fixed and unchanging, and another that is that doctrine thought of slightly more broadly can be actually defined by the emergence of further light and truth, and that therefore, from this perspective, doctrine can evolve and change because we as humans are evolving and changing and receiving greater and greater light and truth. And so in closing, I really appreciated the way you navigated the situation, walking into the situation, wanting to make space for a different word that would build in the changing nature of doctrine as it has been proven to change. And then you ended this conversation by saying, listen, why don't we look at a couple of different ways to think about doctrine, which allows for our church to be exactly what it claims to be, which is a living organism that is allowed to receive further light and truth. So at the end of the day, it does feel as if there's a possibility for us to all come together and recognize that we can continue to receive light and truth, not just in issues of gender and sexuality, but in all issues. And that if we moved towards that, we would become such a healthier institution, embracing further light and truth around issues that really, really matter to so many of us on the ground. So anything to say in closing as we end our time together, Taylor?
It's always nice talking to you. Thanks for paying attention to these issues and for giving me a chance to talk about them a little bit more.
Yeah, it's such a pleasure to have you here and to have these conversations. I know they matter to a lot of people because this is very near and dear to the hearts of so many people on the Latter-day Saint and surrounding faith journey. So glad to have you with me, and I will see you, I'm sure, another time. Take care.
Thanks, Valerie. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Latter-day Struggles. Your support for this podcast is extremely valuable to us. If Valerie's work has made an impact in your life, please consider leaving a 5-star rating and review. For info on webinars, classes, support groups, and live events, click the link in today's show notes or visit our website at latterdaystruggles.com. Latter-day Struggles is a proud member of the Dialogue Podcasting Network.
Dialogue Podcast Network.